Hello to you all. How are you? Right. Today we're going to go on our second lecture on Unit 4.25, which is Health and Safety in the Health and Social Care Workplace. And we will try and look at the second learning outcome, understand the ways in which health and safety requirements impact on customers and the work of practitioners in health and social care workplace. Before we go on, I would just like to recap the main aim of the whole unit. The overall aim of the unit is to help learners understand the concept of health and safety and how it can be applied in the health and social care setting. And as I said, today's lecture is basically covering the learning outcome 2, which is understanding the ways in which health and safety requirements impact on customers and the work of practitioners in the health and social care workplace. It might be the GP surgery, the hospital, the care home, the hospice, or any other health and social care workplace that you can find yourself. So to start with that, we would like to first look at the concept of risk assessment. Risk assessment. This is very key as a practitioner of health and social care environment. You should be able to assess risk, and then based upon the risk, design a care plan that will suit service users. So one may ask, what is a risk assessment? Simply put, a risk assessment is a thorough look at your workplace to identify those things, all things, situations, and any processes that may cause harm, particularly to the people, and then evaluate how likely and severe the risk is, and decide what measures should be in place to effectively prevent or control the harm from happening to yourself, to the service users, or to any third party or visitors that may come into the facility. Now, with the enactment of the Management of Health and Safety Work Regulation 1992, it's a requirement for risk to be assessed in all work areas. And as I said already, risk to people you support, risk to yourself, and any other people that will be in the care environment. Now, under the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulation 1999, all risk in the workplace must be assessed. And once the risk is identified, measures need to be in place to reduce this risk. So the key regulations are the Health and Safety at Work Regulation 1992, which makes it a must for risk assessment to be done, and then the Health and Safety Work Regulation 1999. So these two regulations are quite key as far as this lecture is concerned. Now, we may ask ourselves, is risk assessment a requirement? As we have learned from the last slide, it is a requirement based upon those two regulations. Right. So risk assessment is a legal requirement for every employer and self-employed person to make an assessment of the health and safety risk arising out of their work. The purpose of the assessment is to identify what needs to be done to control health and safety. Right, so this is a requirement. So failure to comply by risk assessment will result in sanctions. So it's not just that we voluntarily conduct risk assessment, it's actually a requirement for every employer. So as a health and social care practitioners or aspiring health and social care workers will need to be able to understand the concept of risk assessment in the requirement. The next slide, we will look at identifying potential hazards and risk. Now, if we want to effectively assess risk, then we should be able to identify potential hazards and risks and then deal with them. So the first bit that we will look at in terms of hazard and risks is the risk of infection. Now, risk of infection should be something that should be taken seriously. For instance, in order to avoid that, we have hand hygiene for all patients, including health and social care practitioners, dealing with blood and body fluid, non-infection diagnosis, vomiting or diarrhea, non-draining wounds are all issues that need to be looked at. In front of us is a table. We have additional precautions, primary reasons, and secondary reasons. So if we look at contact precautions, we might have contact with gowns and gloves. And primary reason would be a known ARO positive or diarrhea. And secondary would be ARO disease alert on the patient chart, including known or recent history of Clostridium difficile, draining infected wounds, weeping, cellulitis, shingles, or as a result of gown and gloves. Droplet precautions. Primary reasons might be respiration infection with symptoms, or new or worsening coughs are all risk. Secondary reasons are known MRSA in sputum, if one or more of the following: fever, headache, sore throat, general ashes and pains, lethargy, and chest discomfort. Vomiting, fever, with diarrhea, with one or more of the following being cough, headache, and rash. These are all risks that could be looked at. We've got airborne precautions. Primary reasons being rash, resembling vesicles, pustules, and macules. The secondary reasons, if any of the following, being cough, headache, head pain, and malaise. Right, so in terms of identifying hazard, the first one that we look at is infection. Now, when we look at the next slide, apart from infection, we have risk of fire in the health and social care environment. We have common cause of workplace fires, common source of ignition, which could be cigarette, matches and lighters, overloaded electrical sockets, open gas flames, ovens and hot plates, deep fat fryers, faulty or damaged electrical equipment, and common source of fuel include wood, paper, loose paper, packaging materials, and waste rubbish. These are all fire hazards and risks that are commonly found in the workplace. The next slide concentrates and give more explanation to fire hazards, which are often found as posters in the workplaces. We've got sources of ignition, and we've got cigarette, matches and lighters, with our low-tech electrical socket, open gas flames, oven and hot plates, deep fryers as source of ignition. Then source of fuel, we have wood, paper, loose packaging materials, waste, rubbish, and furniture. For instance, if you have a loose paper in the basket without shredding, then it becomes a potential source of fire hazard. Right, so we've looked at infection, we have looked at fire. The next slide will look at potential hazard and risk that we often found in homes, resulting out of trips and falls. Now, there are a lot of causes of slips, trips, and falls in the health and social care environment that needs to be risk assessed. There are various factors that can contribute to the risk of slip and trips. In terms of slips, it usually occurs when there is a loss of grip between the shoe and the floor. In the nursing home environment, it's likely to occur where frail service users must usually trip and fall, and this might lead to breaking bones in the hips, which could be quite fatal. In the hospital environment, we still have the issue of trips and falls happening. Therefore, such issues should be properly risk assessed based upon service users, looking at how prone they are to such risk. Now, trips and falls commonly occurs when there is a contaminant between the shoe and the floor. Trips occur when the person's foot hit a low obstacle in the person's path, causing a loss of balance. And often, the obstacle is not easily visible or noticed. So, in order to assess such risk of trip and fall, there is the need for us as health and social care practitioners or potential health and social care practitioners to look at possible causes of such slips, trips, and falls. And once we are able to minimize it or eliminate it, then we'll have a safe and secure environment for service users. So we've looked at infection, hazard and risk. We have looked at trips and falls. And then we've also looked at fire. These are all hazards and risks that need to be risk assessed. And all that we need to do is to be able to identify such potential hazards and risks so that we'll be able to avoid it happening. Right. The next slide is pictorial representation for trips and falls. We have human factors contributing to trip and falls, which are issues that we should be able to identify. For example, we might end up lifting so much load that we can't. And that is a human factor. and which is possibly going to cause us to do what? Trip and fall. We might also find ourselves with wet, muddy, or greasy shoes as a result of maybe cleaning and then the floor becoming so slippery. In that case, we as carers, service users, or third parties being visitors may trip and fall, as can be seen in the image in the middle top. So wet floor, muddy floor, or greasy shoes are potential hazards and risk. Then at the top right, we have irregular steps. For instance, in the care homes, we should be identifying irregular steps that are likely to cause service users to trip and fall. Because once a step is missed, potential risk of trip and fall becomes quite rare. So we should be able to know the type of service users we are having, should be able to identify such potential irregular steps so that we'll be able to minimize the risk, first identify, and to be able to minimize the risk of trips and fall. And then we have a common potential hazard and risk. For instance, uncovered hoses, cables, and wires, just as has been shown at the bottom of the slide on the left. Sometimes we might, as service users, as staff, be trying to clean or hoover a living room. We might end up plugging the hoover at the socket and forget to alert service users. And this is one of the potential dangers for trips and falls. So we should be able to identify all that so that we'll be able to avoid trips and falls. And then we have highly polished surfaces. Highly polished surfaces are also potential risk for trips and falls. So trips and falls could be in different forms and different shapes. So as health and social care practitioners, we should be able to conduct risk assessment by trying to identify all such potential hazard and risk that might result from trips and falls. Now, once we are able to do that, we'll be able to reduce any potential to harm for service users. Now, apart from risk of infection, fire, trip and fall, another potential hazard that is often faced in the health and social care environment is food risk, which is very, very, very important. That needs to be looked at. Food risk. A food safety hazard is something that is dangerous. It's likely to cause harm to food. And these food safety hazards include physical, chemical, and biological risk to food. Therefore, as part of risk assessment, it is important to identify food safety hazards, as some foods are more susceptible to microbial contamination than others and can be considered high-risk food. And this high-risk food include fish and seafood, meat, and small goods, poultry and game, dairy and egg-based foods, wet dishes, soup, stock, and sauces, fruits, including rock melon, watermelon, blueberries, fruit salad, pre-made salad, pate and soft cheese, ice cream, and cooked rice and pasta. These are foods that can easily get contaminated. So most often, apart from fire, infections, trip and fall, food risk is a potential hazard, a risk that needs to be identified through risk assessment. There is one particular area that is often ignored, and it can have quite serious implication in the health and social care environment. So supposing you are working in the care home, or the hospital, or GP surgery, or in a hospice, or in a child care environment, or any other health and social care environment, and you are asked to conduct risk assessment, what are the potential things that you need to look for? That is the concept of risk assessment. Now, once we are able to identify potential hazard and risk, be it from food, from fire, from trip and fall, from infection, then you can formulate a proper care plan for service users. So in a typical care home environment, if a resident who has just been admitted is partially sighted, what are the potential risks that such a person faces? The person is partially sighted. What are the potential risks that the person faces? In the same way, if a resident is hard to hear, what are the potential risks? If a resident that has just been admitted is a chain smoker, what are the potential risks? These are all issues that will impact on the care planning, depending on the nature of the resident in the care home. So just look at your working environment. Who are the clients? Who are the service users? What is the nature of the environment? Can you look at any fire hazard? Anything that is potential risk for fire? What about infection? Has any of the residents caught cold? Has any of the resident or service users has any potential disease that is likely to spread? Have you taken all those into consideration? How do you then decide to design a care plan to be able to meet the need of that very service user? So we could see that the issue of risk assessment is quite crucial for health and social care practitioner, irrespective of the environment where you find yourself. That is the reason why risk assessment is mandatory for all employers. And this is more important in health and social care environment where we deal with vulnerable service users. So the risk can affect service users, it can affect yourself as a carer, and it can affect visitors that come to the environment. If we look at the last slide, because of the potential nature of risk resulting as a result of food, we have a 2-hour to 4-hour rule stipulating the length of time food spent in the danger zone should be minimized in order to keep food safe. And as a guide, if a refrigerated food or hot food has been in the temperature danger zone, the 24-hour, the 4-hour or 2-hour rule can be used. So just ask yourself, for how long can you keep vegetables taken out of the fridge before it is used? Look at fish. Look at ice cream, which are likely to attract food risk. So these are issues that should be taken into consideration in the health and social care environment. So risk assessment is mandatory. And as a health and social care practitioners, we should be able to understand the concept of risk assessment. We should be able to know the regulations covering risk assessment. We should be able to identify any potential hazard and risk, be it infection, fire, trip and fall, and food risk. And once we are able to assess that, we'll be able to keep the environment safe for service users in particular, and to ourselves as well as anybody in the care environment. This is a very short presentation, and I believe it's going to guide you and help you understand working out your assignment, and hopefully you'll be able to contextualize your assignment based on your working environment, and try and use specific example as I've explained in the care environment, and try to reference all work, and then at the end of the assignment, try and then bring out your bibliography showing all the sources that you use. Use practical examples to demonstrate your understanding on the issue of risk assessment. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you. Bye.